Thank you to the people who helped make this happen. So Sophie, Dassie, Meg, and Tanya as well. Thanks a lot. It's been really amazing, the help that I've gotten in the preparation for this. And also thank you for your interest too, because I think this is a really important topic that needs to be much more widely appreciated, to be honest. It's you might have heard that in recent years mistletoes are now acknowledged as a keystone resource in our region, and that's in regards to their influence on woodlands, and in particular the study that proved their status as a keystone was looking at bird diversity, and it found that with the removal of about 38,000 mistletoes from a bunch of woodland plots as part of this study, that resulted in a 34% decline in the woodland resident bird diversity. So a massive, massive impact that these things are having, and yet you almost never hear of them being planted in revegetation or restoration projects. So there's a gaping hole in the way that we try to restore ecosystems. Because as we know, the analogy of a keystone in an arch is that it may seem a small part, but you remove it and it changes the structure pretty radically. So hopefully what we're doing here at the Yalukit Willam Nature Reserve is the opposite of that mass removal of mistletoes. We're putting several locally extinct and locally uncommon species back in, and hoping to see a resurgence in some long lost wildlife. Now, I won't go into too much detail on why to plant mistletoe unless people are particularly interested in that. I'm more hoping to talk about the practicalities of getting the most out of your efforts. But for those who don't know, I should just quickly say that study I mentioned, it actually found that the strongest influence felt by any group of birds, in an ecological group, was those that feed on invertebrates in the leaf litter. They were the group that was hardest hit by the removal of mistletoes, which surprised a lot of people because, of course, there are many birds that feed on the fruit, preferentially nest in mistletoes or feed on the nectar, and of course they were impacted, but not as much as those that search for invertebrates in the leaf litter. So quite amazing that mistletoes are having such a strong influence beyond just the area that they occupy. Now, I'll start off, I'll actually turn this around. Maybe a bit laggy or something, just to make sure. Doing that right. We might end up 3 slides ahead now or something. But anyway, I don't really need the slides that much. Wanted to talk about some of the mistletoes in Melbourne and actually help you to identify them too. So this here, drooping mistletoe, would have been the most common species by far in southeast Melbourne previously. It became locally extinct in to the north, city of Port Phillip, a long time ago. It's hard to even know when. It persisted in some of the small bushland reserves in Bayside up until about the 70s, and probably just beyond, but is no longer there. And you now have to go out to about Frankston before you start to find it. But as I said, it should be the most common mistletoe locally. And that's drooping mistletoe, or Amyema pendula. And I can sort of hand it around. One way to identify it, you can see the sort of rusty colour on the new growing tips and a sort of rough texture, if you want to have a look at that.
Is that creeping mistletoe?
This is drooping mistletoe. I'll show you creeping mistletoe as well. The most common one in urban and sort of suburban Melbourne now is creeping mistletoe. Which I think by good fortune of living on long-lived large hosts like river red gum, preferentially, it's been spared more often by development, and also it can jump ship.
Trees as well.
Yeah, exactly. It can jump ship to introduced trees, many different introduced trees. So it actually grows very, very well on things like pin oaks, London plane trees. I've seen it on golden elm as well. And so this is the one that you'll see sort of lining the Nepean Highway, especially now that a lot of the trees have lost their leaves. And yeah, I'll talk a bit more about the details of them as we go through. Hopefully I can actually change slides there. Let's try again. Oh, did that work? There we go. Just got to hit it harder. But yeah, there you go. So that's drooping mistletoe. You can see it's got those reddish growing tips. And these are all spotted Jezebel butterflies in caterpillar form there.
That was the drooping, sorry.
Yeah, that's drooping, and that's it from a bit further away, growing on a drooping she oak, one of its less common hosts. This is creeping mistletoe, the one I just showed you. It's a much smoother, shinier, and with rounder leaves, and it favours red gums, but it'll grow on a lot of other things too. Then we've got grey mistletoe. We'll actually get to see this when we go out into the reserve. I have a little bit of that here. So much paler, and sort of it has a sort of powdery bloom on it. And this is an acacia specialist. So you can pass that around too if you like. This is grey mistletoe or Amyema quandang, and it tends to grow on acacias only. I'll go into more detail on that. I'm glad we've got the slideshow up. Now, wire-leaved mistletoe, this would have been certainly around the southeastern suburbs, particularly along the coast or anywhere where acacias were dominant or abundant. Wire-leaved mistletoe, or Amyema preissii, and it's a super fast-growing mistletoe. It often lives on really short-lived hosts, like golden wattle or black wattle, so of course it needs to grow fast, because its host might only be around for another 10 years or so. And a particularly important one for a bird called the spiny-cheeked honeyeater. Where you find this in great abundance, you'll often find spiny-cheeked honeyeaters actually stay put year-round. They have a very strange migration pattern, spiny-cheeked honeyeaters. Through a lot of their range, they're just sort of a resident of arid or semi-arid areas, and then there's this strange pattern where they actually come into Melbourne from way up in the northwest. There's nowhere really in between where you regularly get them. They come into Melbourne in the winter and autumn, and I think it's probably down to the fact that we used to have a lot of wire-leaved mistletoe fruiting at that time, especially around the eastern side of the bay. We don't any longer, but I did go out to collect these yesterday and today, and the spots where you still get a lot of wire-leaved mistletoe, the sort of distal end of the Mornington Peninsula and Bellarine Peninsula, you actually still get spiny-cheeked honeyeaters as a resident bird, which is really amazing. They're the only two places in the greater Melbourne area where that happens, and it just so happens that they overlap with this plant. The other thing is this is more typically a mistletoe of inland, semi-arid sort of acacia shrubland. So who knows what came first, the honeyeater or the mistletoe, but it's fairly likely that they brought that mistletoe with them as they moved in. And that's a plant.
Was that just being along the coast, or would it be sort of
inland as well? It all depends on whether you've got the right host species, but in our area it tends to be, as I said, on the Mornington and Bellarine peninsulas, but this one I got today from the Yuyangs this morning. So, this is box mistletoe. Got a little bit of that here. Looks very similar to drooping mistletoe, but now if you pass them around, you will see the difference. These are both box mistletoe, so it is pretty fine leaf, and also the growing tips are smooth. It's all very shiny, and that's probably the most useful difference to look for. Quite different in its habits, I suppose. Most of the time, there's not a lot of overlap on the trees that they'll grow on. Box mistletoe, as its name suggests, tends to grow on a lot of box species and also on ironbarks too. So it grows in the drier areas, whereas drooping mistletoe is the most common mistletoe on sort of the coastal side of the divide. This one is Harlequin mistletoe, not a super common one around Melbourne, and it's like the wire-leaved. It's typically an inland sort of semi-arid mistletoe, but probably has been brought in, I imagine, by spiny-cheeked honeyeaters. So you'll see it's got sort of flat leaves, although they are long and thin, they're also flat. So Feel free to pass those around.
What was that one again?
That's Harlequin Mistletoe. And I'll put this in circulation too. I'll snap it so that people can, and I'll ask you guys first, so it probably makes sense to start at the end, doesn't it? So hopefully you're getting a feel for the different types.
Why?
Which brings in the spine cheek.
So onto the sort of more practical side of things. Seed collecting. The fruit look very different, and also they don't all display ripeness in the same way. And if you're collecting fruit to propagate, you need to know that they're ripe.
So this one is, I just squished it.
In the case of creeping mistletoe, it stays exactly the same colour. And what you need to do is actually do what the mistletoe bird does and feel it. Or it's a bit like testing avocados, really. Once you feel that it's a bit squishy, it's ready to go. Whereas wire leaf mistletoe, the one in the middle, you can see it goes that sort of pale pink with hot pink spots all over it. And then that's drooping mistletoe, looking very similar to what box mistletoe will look like, except rougher in texture. That's an unripe mistletoe fruit. If you try to squeeze it, it's just going to splatter everywhere with this sort of milky stuff. Whereas a ripe one will just sort of gently squeeze out, which I can give you a little. Well, we will get to do a demo of that. And for those wanting to actually go out and have a look for themselves and also collect seed for propagation, these are some of the sites that I found are the best for each species in the Melbourne area, so probably not everyone can read those. The creeping mistletoe, probably the best spot for that in terms of how the plant is faring, is a little corner of Royal Park, funnily enough. But then also in the southeastern suburbs around Chelsea, Seaford, that sort of thing. Drooping mistletoe, as I said, you've got to go out to the far southeast now, into the bigger reserves. Grey mistletoe, you can find it along the lower Yarra on some of the better, larger reserves, especially where there's been a lot of planting of blackwood and and silver wattle. And then it's starting to appear along some of the lower Mary Creek, and it's pretty firmly established in the Darebin Creek as well, the revegetated sites, that is. Wire-leaved, as I said, used to be probably a bit more widespread than it is now. In fact, the top 4 were almost certainly found in this area here. As to the others, they may have been sort of restricted in range, but it's quite likely when we had a lot more drooping she oak around once upon a time, we would have probably had Harlequin mistletoe. And there were patches of drier woodland as well, even to the south of us. Like there were yellow gums and things like that, so we could easily have had box mistletoe around as well. Now that's a rough guide of the kind of seasonality of their fruiting. If you want to collect fruit, you've of course got to go at the right time. And so that's January, February, March, April, May along the top. And what I find, drooping and box mistletoe, you can usually find some at any time of year, although you have to check a lot of different plants. The others have reasonably well defined seasons, although they can sort of break the rules sometimes, more so than I think other plants do. But that's a general guide. Now, here's a lesson that I definitely learnt the hard way, and this is in Royal Park, and although there are literally hundreds of creeping mistletoes in a tiny little, about 7 hectare area, it is near impossible to find a ripe mistletoe fruit. And I hear from a lot of people who have tried to collect mistletoe fruit that they really struggle to get the numbers. And I'm hoping to help with that, because we've collected more than we need of quite a few mistletoes in the last couple of days. And the trick is to go to areas where mistletoe is sort of an anachronism. And what I mean is that you look at places like Royal Park, the mistletoe is doing very well. You can go to this tiny little patch full of mistletoe birds, full of silver-eyed, white-plumed honeyeaters, other things that are spreading the seeds around, and they are onto those ripe fruit as soon as they ripen. Yeah. So when you walk around this particular area, the white-skin habitat, you see young mistletoes all over the place, popping up on the red gums. That's a really good sign, but it's hard to collect there. So what you find when you actually start looking for mistletoe fruit is you end up in places like this, on the edges of busy roads and things like that, and in particular in areas with noisy miners, because there are a lot of places where you've got old, decades-old mistletoes surviving from a time before noisy miners really took off in the Melbourne area. And noisy miners moved in, no more mistletoe birds, no more spiny-cheeked honeyeaters, all those sorts of things. So the fruit just ripens on the plant and falls to the ground. So we probably collected about 150 mistletoe fruit just right on that one clump, just sitting there. It was really easy. The other trick is not only do you get a lot of ripe fruit, but you also get higher survivorship. It comes in the middle of two roads, and I think that is likely due to the fact that there's going to be less common brush-tailed possums, which are a major control agent for mistletoes. Not to say they're a bad thing, but they eat mistletoes, and in a lot of areas where there's a lot of brush-tailed possums, you get fewer mistletoes. So you've got more of them in the median strips, and then where there's noisy miners as well, as there was in this site, then the fruit's more available. When it comes to planting the mistletoes, we're going to do a little trial of that, and hopefully plant out a few sections of the reserve. But it's a fairly low success rate. You've really got to collect big numbers to get any outcomes, really, and that's just a classic sort of case of luck of the draw. You might be able to see, had two nice healthy mistletoes on the way. This is creeping mistletoe on a red gum, bark exfoliation, took it out. And so nowadays, if I'm really putting the effort in, if I haven't got many seeds on a particular day, I'll look for spots where the bark has just recently exfoliated, and that's going to give it the longest possible time to form a good, strong union with the host there. That's just one thing. Then I did mention brushies. I've watched brush-tailed possums mow through a tree that I planted 2 years earlier and just clear all the mistletoes out. And as I said, that's not a bad thing. In fact, in areas where, and a lot of you would know, there are areas where mistletoe becomes overabundant, and I'll talk about the role that brush-tailed possums can play in remedying that. But we're mostly looking at trying to give advantage to the mistletoes where they're struggling.
Now, possums move it out like the mistletoes do?
No, and they tend to eat the foliage. So the thing is, once mistletoe loses its foliage, it doesn't have any storage of energy like another plant might to send out leaves again. So once it's defoliated, it's gone. Yep. And I'm not sure whether that's going to be doing any damage, but I do see a lot of insects going and having a nibble on the freshly planted seeds as well. And that's a European earwig there. Now, I should say, just quickly, I'll skip back. With brush-tailed possums, they have a bias to feed higher up in the tree where they feel more comfortable. So I've found that most of the time, lower planted seeds will do better in areas where there's a lot of brush-tailed possums. Now, I'm not mentioning ringtails because they don't seem to eat a lot of mistletoe. It's the brushies that go for it. But the flip side to planting them low down is that particularly where you've got a lot of trees crammed into a small area, you'll notice if you watch red gums over time, they tend to give up on their lower branches and focus more on higher branches. So you'll see that's actually another creeping mistletoe that was going really well, and that lower branch just gave up. And that's not because of the mistletoe, it's only tiny. That was quite a large branch. So I've noticed that in places like Westgate Park, where I've planted thousands of creeping mistletoe, those on the lower branches have died purely because of this process of the red gums giving up on their lower branches over time and focusing where the resources are. So it's kind of this balance of you want to plant low because to avoid overbrowsing, but then so it's about sort of observing the local conditions. If you've got a tree that's really isolated, then you can probably plant wherever you like on it, because not only it's less likely to have brush-tailed possums visiting all the time, but also that tree is going to be getting sunlight all over it, all the way down to the bottom. So you'll find that mistletoe does a lot better on isolated trees or along edges. Now, planting mistletoe, the actual methods, this is how it used to be done, and although it hasn't been done a lot, to be honest. This was a project by the city of Melbourne. They ended up collecting and planting about 800 creeping mistletoe fruit, which at the time was the biggest planting of mistletoes ever anywhere. And very expensive, arborists and cherry pickers and that sort of thing. When I set out about 3 years ago on this kind of experiment, I obviously didn't have that kind of money, but this is not what you want to be doing. That was my first idea, to get to the outer foliage. Or that's actually there's a tight rope between two trees and a hooked ladder. I'm still here to tell the tale. No. It worked.
That's why the council doesn't like you.
Yeah, exactly. But eventually came to a ridiculously simple solution, which is planting them with a pole. And we're all going to try doing that today. And this, it would be good if this got a bit of traction, because this opens up planting of mistletoe to just about anybody. And also, even organisations like I think BirdLife have now started using the pole method for their Regent Honeyeater recovery program, which is really exciting, because you can imagine how expensive and clumsy it would be trying to get a cherry picker through the bush. So that weird looking thing there is a creeping mistletoe seed. You'll find they've got these long sticky tails which you want to sort of dangle. Other seeds, like the wire leaf, doesn't really have the tail. So I've trialed a few things. This was actually a tube with a little air pump at the bottom that you could, you'd have the tube way up in a tree on a pole and you just pump the seeds out. That worked pretty well, but it's kind of over-engineered. That was because I wanted to plant lots really quickly. But I find you can just stick the seeds to a smooth surface like that screw there, or we've got some different tools out there. As long as it's smoother than the surface that you're going to be adhering it to, the seed should move from one to the other quite easily, if that makes sense. And of course, while you're planting, you've got to choose your hosts. So this is, of course, not an exhaustive list, and while resources are available, there has been research into every single host used by every mistletoe. You can find that list online. It doesn't give you an indication of the likelihood that it's actually going to work. That's just, it's as observations listed, basically. So I've done this so that you actually get an idea of, where you're going to get high success rates. And this is just over the last 3 years observing where they tend to occur. So can anybody not read that from where they are? Or is everyone all right? I saw a few people taking photos. That's exactly what I was hoping. Probably don't have to dwell on that too much. Yeah, go for it. So you can see that creeping mistletoe has more successfully than any other jumped ship to a lot of introduced ornamentals, hence why it's probably still with us today. And that's creeping mistletoe on the right there.
How many of the City of Melbourne ones worked in that?
They got about a 3% success rate, and that was in the first year or two. So having watched these for 3 years, you get a high success rate at the start, but then things like the possums or the branch dieback tend to take effect. And also I've had several beautiful big ones go from either branch fall or things like that. Yeah. So
What about weather, like wet weather and conditions?
I've put up hundreds of seeds before a big rainstorm, and they adhere perfectly fine. They stay there. Yeah, they're very, very good at sticking, as long as you pop them up there right, which we'll go through that process. And now, yes.
What age tree? Do they have to be on established tree?
No, that's an interesting question. No one really knows the answer, but I have found a higher success rate on slightly larger trees. I've planted some of the acacia specialist mistletoes on some pretty young black wattles, 4 years old, and they've taken beautifully. So they don't have to be very old, no. Now, what I mean by secondary or occasional hosts, this is where, in the Melbourne area, I've seen them growing on that particular host, not very often, but they are capable of it. So if you wanted to plant mistletoes in your area and that's all you've got, at least you can give it a go. But that previous list is more preferable hosts. Anything worth mentioning there? Yeah, I kind of like the idea, it's similar to the City of Melbourne's, of using mistletoes to enhance the habitat value of non-Indigenous trees. And in that circumstance, I don't think there's anything wrong with absolutely packing a tree full of mistletoe as much as it can take, because you're going to be getting a lot more benefit for wildlife out of it. So in areas where you've got Casuarina glauca or Cunninghamiana, the two introduced sheoaks really commonly planted, it would be worth trying something like Harlequin Mistletoe in those, I think. And same goes for in an area like this where we happen to have a lot of planted red box or Werribee blue box, which probably wouldn't have been in our area before, and is also helping along the noisy miners. Getting a few box mistletoes into that would probably not hurt. Ecologically, they're very similar in what they offer to drooping mistletoe, but it's just converting a lot of that eucalypt foliage with the lerps and things like that into something which is going to be providing a lot more invertebrates in the leaf litter, some density in the canopy as well. So I would like for us to try that here on some of the introduced trees that we're not going to get rid of, just pack them full of mistletoe. Now I mentioned that pattern where you've sort of got to think about the branch dieback and also possum browsing. In a place like this in Westgate Park, there's been a much lower success rate, mostly because of the connectivity of the trees. So you tend to find mistletoe does better in more sparse, sort of more savanna-y landscapes like that. So we've got Jawbone Reserve at the top, and then the white skink habitat I mentioned with some of the densest creeping mistletoe populations anywhere in Melbourne. They're the kind of places where it really thrives.
And is that, you thought, because of full sun? Is that one of the reasons?
Partly it's probably that the trees have a lot more resources to spare, but also that pattern of possums not being as prevalent. They're still there, and that's good that they're still there, because that way you don't get an imbalance of too much mistletoe. When you see eucalypts that are being left out on their own in the middle of a paddock covered in mistletoe, it's partly because there's no brush-tailed possums there, and also you've lost all your nectar sources in the understory that would have fed the Jezebels that lay their eggs on the mistletoe, and also fire's another major controller of mistletoe too. But yeah, so now I better mention, now I'm sort of getting into, I suppose, planning a landscape to be conducive to mistletoes, because that's where restoration comes in. So we're not just planting it and watching one mistletoe grow, we're hoping that it actually will reproduce and continue to spread. We want to sort of kickstart the process, but then it takes care of itself. And this is an interesting example for many reasons. I often take people there talking about the design of our parks and how they could be tweaked to sort of reverse the decline of small bush birds, because here you've got a sort of what looks like a typical park landscape, it's widely spaced trees, mostly eucalypts too, and yet it's really holding off noisy miners in a big way. And that is bordering on 180 hectares of just dense noisy miner population. So really interesting little pocket there. The mistletoes probably have a role to play. So noisy miner, in case anyone didn't know, not to be confused with common miners. I'll just go back in case anyone didn't look at the stats. So the surveys that I was doing was just comparing noisy miner populations with small bush birds, so under 60 grams, which is the weight of a miner. And at the white skink habitat, you can regularly get 11 species under 60 grams, which is quite phenomenal. I won't linger on this stuff, but the blue line there is noisy miners over time. The orange one is white plumed honeyeaters over time at Gasworks Park. So thankfully they started recording the data. It was just general bird surveys, and I've just teased this out of it, but thankfully they started recording before noisy miners took off there, so we can actually see what happens. There you've got sort of the typical dominance of small bush birds in a really wide range of habitats. So you've got everything from dry woodland to even warm temperate rainforest, and then you've got almost grassland there, all dominated by those birds in the smaller category. That's the orange. So that's birds under 60 grams, and then the blue is birds over 60 grams. So in almost any habitat, it's typical for those smaller birds to really dominate. This is what our urban areas look like, flipped on its head entirely. And that's largely due down to noisy miners. And of course, the kind of birds that are among that group are the ones that spread mistletoe. So you can start to see why it's struggling to recruit. That's a mistletoe bird on the left, white plumed honeyeater, silver eye, spiny cheek honeyeaters are a sort of underappreciated associate with mistletoe. Any questions on that? I suppose I can keep moving through.
I'd be interested, it's
Yep.
probably slightly off track, but there's, I used to have heaps of little birds in my garden just in Hampton because we've got a mad garden that no one ever pulls any weeds. It's just crazy. And now it's only got Indian miners. I mean, not Indian,
noisy
sorry,
miners, yeah.
noisy miners and a few Currawongs and things. What's happening to control the noisy miners? Is there anything?
Yeah, not much yet. No, it's sort
Is
of
it
an
building?
underappreciated issue.
Okay.
But really it comes down to they're a native bird, so they were in the region previously, although nowhere near as widespread or abundant, and they have succeeded because of the changes to the habitat that we've imparted on the landscape. So they really like areas that they can commandeer a resource, and that for them the most important resource is lerps, those little sugary spots that you'll sometimes see on gum leaves. And they can only really do that in areas where there's not opportunities like thickets or isolated dense shrubs and things like that for small birds to get away in. And if you look around most parks and golf courses, it's just gum trees, nicely spaced, big open canopies, very easy to defend with nothing underneath except for lawn. So that it's a recipe for success for the noisy miners. So really continuous, it can be patchy it seems, from the places that I've surveyed. And also not having such a strong bias towards the eucalypts in the first place. So you find they're planted all over the place, and we forget about wattles and she oaks and things like that that don't pump out so much sugar, which is what really fuels the aggression and the defence, because sugars that are being produced are a reliable resource. Something will defend it because it knows that it'll get rewarded, Whereas things like she oaks and acacias, where it's more insects and seeds that are driving that food, but once you've eaten them, they're gone. So it favours a wider range of birds essentially. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. And then I did mention before cases where, and they're quite rare in urban areas, where mistletoes can start to take a toll on tree health, and probably, as I said, part of the answer, getting hollows back into the landscape. That's something that we're often missing. So that's actually a nest box locally that has a brushtail and a ringtail, with a brushtail joey as well, living together. So you can tell that hollows are in short supply. Of course, there's a balance that needs to be struck there too. Recognising when your seeds are working, that's a drooping mistletoe. Looks quite different to creeping mistletoe, which kind of sits there for ages and ages, it doesn't do much, and then one day will sprout. But when you start to see that reddish colour coming through, it's happy. It's likely going to work. And I should mention as well, in choosing a site to plant, branch thickness does seem to be important for some species, but not for all of them. So for all of the genus Amyema, so that's the box mistletoe, drooping mistletoe, wire-leaf mistletoe, grey mistletoe, they don't seem to be able to penetrate through very thick bark at all. And usually they'll do best if you plant them on quite a thin branch, sort of finger or pencil thickness is good. And that's a grey mistletoe which was planted here on the reserve, and that's it about 12 months later.
Wow.
So they're a pretty fast grower.
Gee,
Yeah.
great mistletoe.
Yeah. Whereas, I should say, Muellerina or creeping mistletoe, that can grow almost anywhere on a tree where you've got smooth bark still. So on a red gum, you could plant that on a branch this thick, and it's likely going to take just as well as it would on a pencil thin branch. And it's probably preferable to be planting them on those larger, thicker branches anyway, because they're less likely to as they grow, they're less likely to cause the branch to fall and that sort of thing. If you've got one on a little tiny twig and it's starting to, it'll weigh down. And also, creeping mistletoe sends out these tendrils that are sort of searching for this, thin bark to sort of penetrate. And when it's on the end of a thin branch, I've noticed the tendrils will kind of get lost and just spaghetti their way through the air like that, wasting their energy. So I tend to try to put creeping mistletoes on nice smooth branches around sort of that size. And also in a sunny position is best. But I've had success in a range of kind of light conditions, but the general consensus is that sunny positions are best. And in saying this sort of stuff, I should also acknowledge the work of David Watson for his work on mistletoes. He's done a lot of great stuff. I wonder if that worked. No, that just went straight to the end. Just wanted to...
That's interesting because
There you go.
all the mistletoe and the AJ Steel Reserve and your Harlequin Mistletoe, they're on oaks, which are a bit bark. They're really like young.
Yeah, well, it's possible that when are they quite large, or
Yeah.
possible that when they actually first landed, they might have been on a thinner bit of bark, or
I'm going to
because
have a closer.
I reckon they would struggle to get through really thick bark.
What's your success rate with this?
So I've planted about 5,000 seeds, and I'm still working my way through the data. Now that's between many sites. Here on the reserve, probably planted 1,000 or so, or 2,000, something like that, of creeping mistletoe, and there's about 77 healthy mistletoes. There's a lot more that are really, really small. I wouldn't count them as a success yet, but 77 that are kind of looking like what you're seeing there. So that makes this place all of a sudden a hotspot for mistletoe in our area, which it went from having 0 mistletoes, of course it's noisy miner dominated, to now having quite a lot, and we'll hopefully add to that today.
So how do you mark them? How do you mark where you put them?
Oh right, well I keep a note for every single of 5,000 seeds.
Yes.
Branch thickness, height above ground, orientation on the tree, and then solar exposure, and I number the trees as well. So you can then go back and see, okay, well I can't see anything in that spot anymore. Or
And you
can
write a
put-
number on the tree.
Yeah, I've got a little tag on each tree that's got mistletoes. And so I planted probably an average of about 80 seeds on every tree.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's on the red gum. So some of them have almost every single seed took, and of course that's a bit too much. And then on others, none at all. So it's an interesting kind of pattern there. And that's from a very early stage. So it's not, it's not the case now that all of them have survived, but in the early stages, some of the trees seemed a lot more hospitable than others, which is really interesting. We've probably got a mix of provenance of red gums here. So probably not all of these are the local red gums. So that might be playing a role. And yeah,
Tree
there's...
doesn't have the fence for it?
Well, no. I mean, it doesn't seem that trees really will kill them off. Yeah, the failure tends to happen sort of early on, but once it's established, I don't think there are many ways that the tree. Yeah, that's right. And I should say as well, people get worried about the tree itself, and I would say. A mistletoe is a very long-lived plant, and killing its host is suicide. It's not what it wants to do, right? So it's a bit of a poor life strategy, right? And although in those exceptional cases where you have lots and lots of mistletoe because of the environmental changes that have occurred, that can cause problems. But I've noticed resistance in places like Westgate Park from a few of the people who have been there for a while, worried that the mistletoe is going to harm the trees. But really, it's about the same as planting another tree near your existing tree, because it's just taking a small amount of the water and nutrients from that tree. And in fact, that other tree that people would very happily plant near an existing tree is also going to shade that tree, which is doing even more than the mistletoe would ever do. So no need to be too scared of what they're going to do to the tree. I think that's pretty well established. That's just not just me saying that. But I suppose we'll...
It's possible that there's also a net benefit, because if it's getting more insect activity underneath the tree and bringing in birds and things like that, you're actually getting more nutrients under the tree.
That's a pretty good thought. The mistletoes aren't locking up a lot of nutrients. They're actually dropping their leaves without even withdrawing the nutrients from them. So underneath the mistletoe, the reason for that heightened invertebrate abundance, and in fact it's 1,120 extra arthropods per square metre. That was a David Watson study, which is phenomenal. It's because of that extra nutrients, and also the higher turnover rate of the leaves. So whereas a eucalypt host might hold on to a leaf for 3 or 4 years, mistletoes are turning them over much faster, to the point where once you've got just 10% of the canopy comprised of mistletoe, that tree is dropping twice the load of leaf litter. So yeah, that would be having a positive impact, I would say, on the structure of the soil. And having all of that invertebrate activity in there is going to be turning over the soil as well. So
More birds are going to be pooping more.
exactly, yeah.
Do you treat the seeds at all?
No, they don't need to be treated, interestingly enough, not like a lot of other bird dispersed seeds. So all you do is squeeze them out. I'll show you one, but we're going to
Yeah, I just think if it goes to a bird's gut, it's, would you treat it with gibberellic acid or something like that?
Yeah, well, that's often the case for other bird dispersed seeds, but it seems that you get a very high germination rate, close enough to 100%, just by pushing that out and putting it straight on the tree, which is quite amazing. So here's a creeping mistletoe for you. Just good. And then I'll show you. So you've sort of got to disentangle the tail. It's all wrapped up. There you go.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I'll do a little demo. So here's one of the planting poles. So you don't want it to be too firmly attached to the pole. So I sort of tend to wrap it over and then pull the seed down until there's not much resistance, and then you can. Yeah, it's a fine line. And I've got plenty of seeds for you all to practice on too, and actually plant them in the reserve, which I'm very excited about, getting all these volunteers. So I'll do another one. So there we go. The screw just helps to get it away from the pole so that it's not going to stick too much. You want to sort of maintain that angle, and then once you find a branch that looks like a good one, you put it over to the other side, pull back and down. That's a very slippery branch, isn't it? Because but usually you get a bit of extra friction to work with. There you go. And I haven't found any difference whatsoever in whether the seed is on the top or the bottom of the branch. You'll often hear that it has to be on the bottom. I've had heaps of seeds do just fine on the top or the side or anywhere on the branch, so I'm not so sure about that. I haven't seen any evidence for it in practice, but that's another one that gets talked about a bit. I just haven't noticed any difference myself.
How many years have you been doing them to show that they do survive?
3 years now. Yeah. And I should say, do you remember how I was talking about areas with noisy miners being easier collecting sites? Well, I went round to those supposedly good sites in Fingal and Tukaruk yesterday, managed to collect about maybe at best a dozen wire-leaf mistletoe. I went to some wire-leaf mistletoe that had originated from there that I planted 2 years ago, just up the creek from the reserve, and collected about sort of close to 100, 120 just from 2 plants, because there's not yet anything there utilising that resource. So it really does pay to collect in the right spots. And it's, funnily enough, often those slightly degraded sites that still have a bit of remnant mistletoe. So that was one of the most valuable sort of lessons I think I've learned. In fact, I didn't just go to Fingal and Tookaroo, went to the Yuyangs as well to try to get some, and there was just barely any around. But yeah, on those two mistletoes, yeah, got plenty.
You
So-
say that you noisy miners eat them and actually digest them and not pass them through the gut?
No, the trick there is that the noisy miners actually exclude almost all birds smaller than them, and that is most of the seed dispersers for mistletoes. Yeah, so what you find is in areas of noisy miners, the seeds just fall and you don't get any recruitment of mistletoes. So it's not a good thing, but it's an opportunity for us to actually get better collection rates. This was a cool thing that I found out in the Yuyangs. It's a dead branch, so no issue removing it, even though there's been Harlequin mistletoe dropped and creeping mistletoe dropped on the same branch. We even found one tree that had 4 species of mistletoe on it, and surprise, surprise, it was a black wattle there. Just fantastic in so many ways. A lot of people that you've probably heard me go on about black wattles before. They host every single mistletoe in the Melbourne area. Yeah, I reckon I'll hang on to that one. They'll probably try to germinate. In fact, that one already is. But, anyway.
So black wattles are good, you're saying?
Black wattles
Would
are
you
a
plant-
fantastic host, but they're also great for insect diversity and that sort of thing too. And they don't help the noisy miners by pumping out sugars. So,
Okay.
yeah. Yes.
Are there any permits required for collecting mistletoes, and what are your thoughts about in terms of how much to take, because birds need the
Yeah.
Any principles?
Yeah, well, yeah, unfortunately, even if you're spreading an indigenous plant that's become locally rare or extinct, technically you do need a permit to collect, which it's fairly prohibitive. It's unfortunate, isn't it? You don't need a permit to plant a plane tree or something like that, or something that's really damaging, but spreading the seeds of a good plant. But and that's another reason why it's good to collect from areas that are hampered by noisy miners, is you're not actually removing the food source of anything. Those seeds are there; they're just going to waste. So another good reason. Yep.
So if you're trying to transition an area from being noisy miner dominated habitat, if you were planting mistletoes in that area and at the same time trying to get some shrubby, spiky type stuff in there as well, over time you could, and also perhaps planting more wattles, is that a good strategy?
Yeah, and that's essentially what we're doing here at Yalukit Willam. So when we go for our walk and plant some mistletoes, get a bit of practice, whoever's willing to go for a little walk around, we'll talk about perhaps some of those techniques that we're looking at. There's many ways that you can tackle it. Ideally, you use all of them, but definitely manipulating shelter for small bush birds, but then also the amount of sugars being produced, and then the resources for those small bush birds. If you can bump those up, there are more reasons for more birds to try to be there, and it's going to make life harder for the noisy miners to keep them out. So bumping up the abundance of invertebrates and things like that, which is what our ponds are largely achieving, but it's also what the mistletoes are going to be achieving, as well as creating dense canopies, taking away a little bit of that eucalypt foliage as well. All these sort of cumulative impacts, which hopefully we'll start to see the effects of. In fact, we already are starting to see a bit of a change in the noisy miner abundance in this corner of the park. I shouldn't actually say abundance, influence. They're still there to target any poor bird that tries to fly through here. They're now split between a big flock of starlings, about 50 or so, that have moved in to make use of the wet ground that's appeared. That's keeping them extremely busy. And now we're starting to get things like the odd golden whistler stop off in here, or white-plumed honeyeaters. I've seen more white-plumed honeyeaters in the last 2 months than I have in the last 9 years prior to this. So, and I think the starlings and the fact that there's food for them in the ground have a lot to do with that. So it's not necessarily the plants that are having the influence on the noisy miners, it's the plants influencing the small bush birds, which then make life really hard for noisy miners. So that's sort of the way of thinking about it. Yep. Cool. Yes.
I've got a possum problem. I love the possum
blossoms, but yeah, they're defoliating some large gum trees I have. I was hoping that by inoculating the trees with mistletoe, I would give them an alternative food source. Does that work, or they just would beat it?
Yeah, well, the growth rate of a few mistletoes by themselves won't be able to keep up if the possums are actually defoliating the whole tree. But are they ring-tailed possums? Because in that case,
Mainly bush.
okay, yeah, they'll strip the mistletoes too. Yeah, even in here where we've got a fairly, what you'd think of as a fairly natural kind of density of brush-tailed possums. I put some bands around some of the trees to give the mistletoes a head start, and it seems that on some of them now they seem to be having a little nibble, but not taking out the whole lot. But it sounds like in your case it's probably going to be pretty hard to establish a mistletoe there without a possum band or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Possum bands won't work because they're coming from the
They're all
canopies and
connected,
the
yeah.
roofs and
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, bummer. Can't help you there,
Could
unfortunately.
you somehow protect the mistletoe while it's growing in some sort of
You could try that. Yeah, I don't think that's been done, but
some sort
probably
of
would work, wouldn't it?
I need more than one mistletoe.
Yeah.
just nothing extra.
Yeah. Yeah, as long as it's wildlife friendly and all
Yeah,
that.
gotta be careful, don't
Yeah,
you?
yeah. That sounds perfectly feasible. Yeah.
I'll
Very
invest.
powerful owls.
Cool. Well, if there's no more questions, I reckon we'll do a little bit of the practical side of this. We'll try two species. We've got the wire-leaved and the creeping mistletoe. And this is actually a reintroduction. So the photos I showed you were from upstream. This species hasn't occurred in the reserve area for a very, very long time. So it's exciting to be getting it back. We've planted black wattles in the last 2 or 3 years, and that's where we're going to be putting these guys. We're going to try these in some of the red gums, particularly around sort of the car park area and further out too. So, yeah, whoever would like to come along, please do. Yeah.
Just a quick question about where we find the seed. Like I've seen mistletoe flowers. Is the seed in the end of it?
Yeah. Well, okay. So the flower will, once it's pollinated, will swell into the seed. So they're in these little clusters, same as the flowers. And I found with most mistletoes, it's at the complete opposite end of the year to peak flowering that you'll get peak, ripening of fruit. So if you spot a mistletoe that you want to go back to and you see it flowering, go back at the, in 6 months, and it's likely that you'll get ripe fruit. Yeah, cool. All right, well, let's give it a go. So, these are beautiful little wire-leaved mistletoes. They're very tasty. This one's my favourite. Alright, and then if you lift that up fairly slowly so it's not shaking around, and then you rub it on a branch, it should come off. You might have to really rub it though. See, I mean, it's yeah. So there you go. And if you want, you could probably put a few on. This is going to be fun. A few on each. But don't put too many on, because if you leave them on there for a while you're doing the others, they'll dry out and they'll be more sticky or more stuck to this than they will be on the branch. So maybe put 3 or something. Alright, well let's go. And also, these poles are really long. Don't want to poke anybody with them, so maybe if we're with pairs, a person can hold sort of each end rather than having them sort of up over the back or that sort of thing. So we had a very successful planting of about, I'd say maybe 300 mistletoes of 2 species. We planted both creeping and wire-leaved, but unfortunately the memory ran flat on the camera. So just to help people with the finer points of technique for the 2 different species, because we had so many people, we were using big long bamboo poles, which worked perfectly fine. Might as well just give that demo. So with creeping mistletoe, squeeze the narrower end of the fruit, and then as it's coming out, squeeze again, and that helps to separate out the tail from the sort of body of the seed. And once you've got that like that around either end of the stick until there's not much resistance. And then just about ready to go. Alright, do you want to follow this one up into the tree?
Yeah.
There it goes. So then you go over the other side of a branch and pull back, and there's the seed ready to go. So this is wire-leaved mistletoe, which doesn't have that long sticky tail that creeping mistletoe has. It is very sticky all over though, and I did talk about that sort of pump action method for seeds like this, but you can also just, if you're careful, get them to stick on your bamboo pole just like that, and as long as you're using something smooth like bamboo and then you touch the tree, it's more likely to stick to the other material. So let's just pretend this was nice and high up. Not that you have to do it high up, but you know, it's good to get a range. And remember, this is a pencil thickness branch or similar. That's what these Amyema prefer, whereas the creeping mistletoe not so fussy. And there you go. Here's a little bonus clip from the day before, out collecting fruit in the Yuyangs for the workshop. Alright, drooping mistletoe, box mistletoe, almost connected. They're actually both all through this tree, and then look through here on in. This Harlequin mistletoe growing on a eucalypt, which is you never see, but it's doing it because it's actually growing on a drooping mistletoe. That's its little hostorium.